And now I would like to introduce to you the co-moderator for this second panel, Ms. Đỗ Thanh Huyền from Undp Vietnam. The second panel is on roles, performance, and contributions of Women People's Council's deputy. And I'd like to introduce to you the panelists. The first panelist is Ms. Nguyễn Thị Kim Dung, Vice Chairperson of the Vietnam Fatherland Fund Committee of Hanoi. And the second panelist is Ms. Đặng Thị Anh Đào, Provincial People's Council's member, the previous panel, 2016-2021. The third panelist is Ms. Thùy Dương, Hanoi Municipal People's Council Deputy, 2016-2021. Mr. Đặng, Phạm Đoàn, Hanoi Municipal People's Council Deputy, 2016-2021. And lastly, Mr. Phan Luân, a researcher from CEPEW, a voter. And so in these panelists, we have 5 panelists. And you see that from Hanoi, we have 3 panelists already from Hanoi, right? So more panelists are from Hanoi, but I do hope that all the panelists can share with us their views from their own perspective. And I'd like to invite Ms. Đỗ Thanh Huyền for asking the questions. Thank you very much to Phạm Quang Minh. And we also have, will have a very interesting discussion with the members of People's Councils of the 3 provinces participating in this research in the last 6 months: Hanoi People's Council, Bình Phước People's Council, and Cần Thơ People's Council. Unfortunately, Ms. Anh Đào, Ms. Thanh Loan, sorry, from Bình Phước People's Council has an urgent meeting this morning. That's why she cannot join us in this discussion. And to start with our panel discussion, I would like to ask the first question to a person that impressed me a lot as a voter of Hanoi. And I have also been watching what she has been working on. If she is no longer on this position, that would be a regret for a voter like me, because if anything, as a voter, I would knock on the door of Ms. Thùy Dương first, right? Because she represents me in Hanoi People's Council. So thank you very much for agreeing to participate in the discussion. Ms. Thùy Dương has a very important role in the research. She has helped us in connecting with members of Hanoi People's Council in this research. And she's also a member of the research team. Not in the discussion today, Ms. Thùy Dương will share with us her own views as a member of Hanoi People's Council in the current tenure. Ms. Thùy Dương, are you there? Ms. Thùy Dương, please unmute yourself. Thank you, Ms. Đỗ Thanh Huyền. Yeah. Good morning, Dr. Minh and everyone. Yeah, thank you for agreeing to participate as a member of the People's Council. So the question that I am asking is a bit specific, because we've been watching you not only on the mainstream media, but also on social media. And you are also very active in communicating with voters on social media. And I know that you are advocating for the law on school safety after some tragic incidents in our schools in Hanoi. So can you share with us that challenging to a woman member of the People's Council? Can you share with us? I would be curious to know if I am to run for the election someday. And what are the messages that you would like to convey to the candidates to the People's Council this year? Thank you, Ms. Huyền, for your question. I think that I can respond partially to the criteria that Ms. Hoàng Hương just talked about, not caring really a lot about the gender aspect here. I mean, yes, I don't see any barriers that would prevent me, myself, from working strongly. So I see more advantages rather than barriers or obstacles being a woman member of the People's Council. So Hanoi is where I was born and I grew up, and I can work very closely with my voters. And you know that for any meeting of the People's Council in Hanoi, women make more, make the same, at least the same, or even more inputs than men in voicing their views. So we see that the support from the voters is the first advantage that we have received. The second advantage here is revealed when we work with the voters. When I advocate for the law on school safety, I realize that people all support me because I don't have much expertise in this area. And when I call for contributions and inputs and asking for interviews or discussion, many people supported me, agreeing to talk to me. So we can rely a lot on the voters who are experienced, who have expertise, and who can support us, even if they don't have the expertise. So I think that voters' support is a second advantage that I could have in the last 5 years. Support from leaders and support from voters have helped me perform my duty. Even though the law on safety school is still an ongoing effort, I really have received a support in finalizing a manual, a handbook. As a lecturer, I put together all the knowledge and expertise that I received from the experts. I invited them to work with me and also consolidating the skills that were passed on to me by the members of previous People's Council's tenures. And I think that when I hand over this manual, this handbook on school safety to my successors, they wouldn't have to start from the scratch. And they know where to continue with the law, with the legislation on school safety. And I think that the support from all sides, from all aspects, help me understand the meanings of mobilization of resources. It is not only financial resources or time from everyone. The social capital is the big thing that I can rely on. However, it is also there is also a disadvantage because as an initiator of the school safety law, even though it is still a concept, very premature concept in the beginning, I need to master that idea. I cannot rely, expect to be totally reliant or dependent on other people. So, you know that there are different stages in this journey. You can rely on certain group of people in a certain stage and then rely on others in the next stage. And I am sorry that I have to stop at this point and then handing over what I have done to the successors in the next tenure of the People's Council. So we cannot totally depend on voters, on experts, and asking them to satisfy our expectations. You need to act responsibly and responsible for the journey that you have initiated. And this is at the same time advantage and disadvantage that I have been facing in the last 5 years. And I hope that for all members, elected members, even though my handbook has two parts, the first one is on international experience on school safety, and the second one is on the skills of advocacy. and lobbying, I hope that men elected representatives could also use this as a tool, both in hard and soft copy. So the material can be shared to you to help you to shorten the journey to arrive at the final destination of this proposed law. Your second question, Ms. Huyền, any message to voters? If I am entrusted by the voters, right, then the voters should also be responsible for their votes on the other hand, because this is an opportunity for you to master the destiny of the country, and every 5 years with a very simple activity. You go out there and you select the person that can represent you in voicing up your view, developing the laws, and making important decisions for the country. It is your responsibility, not only your right, it is your obligation. So my call for all voters that let's join our hands for Vietnam's future by a very simple act, by contributing your voter, casting your own vote, if possible, and making the right selection and decision as you believe that it is right. And so once again, I would like to acknowledge the support, not only Hanoi's voters, but the voters from the entire country for supporting the candidates of People's Councils and National Assembly. Yes, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak my mind. Thank you, Ms. Dương. Yes, I recall that Ms. Dương is really very persistent in pursuing the work of Hanoi, and there was once when Hanoi was scored low in party, and Ms. Thùy Dương also asked me what they need to do. And we conducted a small survey to hear more from the voters, and that served as an input for further actions by Hanoi's People's Committee and Hanoi's authorities. And I do hope that Hanoi's People's Committee and People's Council will continue to listen to the views of all members of People's Council at all levels who represent their communities, their voters. Because you know that in our research, one of the highlights here is the preference, perseverance in pursuing one issue. Back to you, Dr. Minh. Thank you for your very impressive views, Ms. Dương. And also thank you for your kind offer for the handbook that you have prepared. This is a great initiative. We can save a lot of time and not having to repeat the previous efforts. And we can help a lot with the new members of the People's Councils in the next tenure. And next, I would like to send a question to Mr. Kim Dung, Vice Chairperson of the Vietnam's Fatherland Front Committee of Hanoi. And Ms. Dung, and she is the only finalist participating this discussion in person. And your presence is a great encouragement to us in this pandemic situation. Ms. Dung, we'd like to ask you two questions. First, in our research, we have a recommendation that we need to ensure the proportion of 45% of each gender to ensure gender equality for all levels of People's Council. Do you think that it is feasible, and why or why not? And as a Vice Chairperson of the Vietnam Fatherland Front Committee of Hanoi, we would like to know what you have been doing, what you have been working on to increase the proportion of women candidates and women's members of the People's Committee. Thank you very much, Dr. Phạm Quang Minh. Ladies and gentlemen, the first question, the feasibility of the recommendation of increasing the proportion of women members of any genders, particularly women's proportion to 45%, I think that it would be unlikely, really very difficult, because based on the facts and what we are having now, and also from all the regulations and resolutions in 2021-2026 tenure, we only have 30% of candidates being women. And we also see that in certain regulations, we still have the terms such as women delegates in the structure or composition of the membership. So we see that even though we are working towards 35%, but it would be difficult because we have only 30% of candidates are women. And also we look at the structure, we look at the proportion of women in the leaders' positions, we still see a very big gap between the number of men and women candidates, reflecting also the proportion of men and women in the leaders' position. And you know, working with the women's union and trade unions to recommend, to nominate candidates for election has not been improved that much. And that is the role of the leader. And the next point is that ensuring fairness in the candidate list. We see that when we prepare the list for the candidates for election, the proportion of women we see the big gaps in allocating women to different lists for elections here. And there are high requirements for the candidates, such as having the strong opinions or ability to persuade, for example. So really the requirements are high. And also from the oversight, election oversight activities, we have been working fairly well on that in Hanoi. However, in different other stages, for example, in the nomination process, I could see that in the inspection and oversight, many localities, many constituencies do not really work seriously in terms of ensuring the proportion of women candidates for election. For the next question that you asked about the measures that we could use in order to increase this proportion, I think that it depends on the leadership of the Parties Committee, the determination of the Parties Committee in exercising their leadership's role in order to increase the women proportion. However, you know that 45% as defined for the time being and for the upcoming period, it would be very hard. So there needs to be a pathway, a roadmap, and phasing schedule to reach that target. It may not be feasible in the short run, But we need to work very hard on that with the strong leadership from the parties committee and the confidence to be enhanced among women ourselves. You know, there are times when women can be given opportunities, but many people refuse and are not confident to assume the tasks or the positions that they may be interested to. So I think that together with the efforts, with the implementation of the resolutions and regulations, the efforts need to be made in educating and convincing women to become really strong, competent, capable in their work and being able to seek support from others so that they can assume the other tasks in the elected bodies. Thank you, Ms. Dung. Yeah, I mean, we are just trying our best to have the candidates to be 45%, women candidates to be 45%. 35% is the target of women's members in the National Assembly and People's Councils by 2030. Yeah, we know that it is challenging, but we still remain hopeful, right? Because we see that the majority of the members participating in this survey, in this research, also believe that there will be a time when they have the same proportion of men and women representation in these elected bodies. Yes, Huyền, please continue with the next question. Yes, thank you very much. Dung, Mr. Đoàn, are you there?
Hello.
Mr. Đoàn, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
Anh Phạm Đình Đoàn ạ.
Vâng, đúng rồi chị ạ.
Vâng, ok ạ. Cảm ơn anh Đoàn.
Thank you, Mr. Đoàn, for joining us.
Với buổi chia sẻ ngày hôm nay, thực sự là chúng tôi cũng rất là ấn tượng với tất cả những cái công việc.
We are also very impressed with your work.
Vâng ạ, vâng. Xin chào anh Đoàn.
Xin chào nhé. Xin chào.
Yes,
Dạ,
good
vâng
morning.
Thế thì
Well,
để anh Đoàn ổn định thì em sẽ xin phép trao đổi ạ. Xong cho anh Đoàn nhỉ?
Xong rồi, okay.
Vâng ạ, vâng, cảm ơn anh Đoàn rất là nhiều.
Chưa thấy xem màn hình.
Xem màn hình. Anh chưa nhìn thấy cái màn hình chung.
Màn hình chung thì không có đâu anh ạ, màn hình chung không có. Chúng ta sẽ cài chụp phần lên cùng với nhau ở trên diễn đàn luôn thôi ạ.
Rồi, ok.
Vâng, cảm ơn anh. Phạm Đình Đoàn là một người rất là đặc biệt ạ. Và ngoài là
Đoàn is a very special person. And apart from being a member of People's Council of Hanoi, he is an entrepreneur
rất là nổi tiếng của tập đoàn Phú Thái.
From Phú Thái Group.
Trong quá trình công tác của anh thì thực ra thì với Huyền thì Huyền theo dõi các hoạt động của Dương và Huyền.
And we've been watching the work of the members of the People's Council, Ms. Dương and Mr. Đoàn. They have been working
anh Đoàn
jointly in many activities. And so we see that Mr. Đoàn represents the voice of businesses as an entrepreneur, a very important element contributing to Vietnam's development and Vietnam's economy. So with the findings of the research that we've been sharing, you know that women members of People's Councils are more interested in education, training in social areas, but not so much in other areas that are considered as men's realm, men's domain. Do you think that they are capable of joining other areas such as economic policies and securities and defense as well? My second question is that as entrepreneur, as a businessman, what do you see, what would you view the role of women entrepreneurs when participating in People's Council compared to women from other professions? Would you like to see more women's business persons from the private sector joining the People's Council? Thank you for the question. So we can see that the proportion of people having experience and qualifications, we have not been able to engage so many people with high expertise and qualifications to the National Assembly and People's Council. Many people are very good, highly capable, and having great expertise, but they do not participate in these elected bodies. And I think that right from the beginning, I think that what we are missing here is calling for the social responsibility of these people and intellectuals, the most qualified and capable people to work in the elected bodies. My second point is that members of National Assembly on People's Councils need to receive professional, specialized training, because they need to be able to explain things or to talk about things in the position of members of National Assembly and People's Council. So training for these members of elected bodies is very important in order to provide orientation and guidance for the members of these elected bodies to speak the right things in their position. Thirdly, I think that in the structure of the National Assembly or People's Council, we need to have full representation of all groups. That's why women's representatives is very important. In Vietnam, we have really high proportion of entrepreneurs being women, and many of them are really good. That's why if we look at the expected proportion here, 30-35% of members being women, we are below that. It means that we have failed to call for community social responsibility among women. And I think that we need to be open to debates and to even criticism. Of course, constructive and positive criticism here. For People's Councils, as I am a member of People's Councils, I see that women members of People's Council are very active and very strong in presenting their views and pursuing the issues of their interest. And I would assess the contributions by most men and women the same. So I strongly support the target of 35% women representation in the elected bodies, so that the representation is fuller and we have more representative coverage of issues being the concerns of all genders. So this is really a very positive objective of increasing women's representation. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Đoàn.
Xin mời thầy Minh ạ.
Yes, Mr. Minh. Thank you, Đoàn and Ms. Huyền. Of the panelists for this second panel discussion, there is a very special guest who is Đặng Thị Anh Đào. Ms. Đào, are you there? Good morning, everyone. Ms. Đào, we are sorry that when we went to Tenure, we could not meet and talk to you. However, we've heard a lot about you. So at the discussion today, we would like to thank you first for agreeing to join us. And we have two questions for you. You know that you are the head of the Financial and Budgetary Committee of Tenure People's Council. And I would imagine that of all committees, this would be the most important committee of the People's Council, right? Because you manage the pocket, right? The budget. And it is similar to the National Assembly. So I think that your committee plays a very important role. So as a woman member of the People's Council, and in that very important position, what are the pros and cons? What are the disadvantages and advantages that you have had being in that position? And what would be your message to send to voters? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Minh. Regarding the question asked by Dr. Minh, I myself am a member of People's Council for 2 tenures as the head of the Economic and Budgetary Issues Committee of the People's Council of Tenure. And I think that when we talk about advantages and disadvantages for women, they would not be any difference from men. I think that just for myself, when being in that position, I just try to do my best with all that I could and with the integrity as a member of the People's Council and full-time member of the People's Council. I know that I need to be the one leading the review and the appraisal of the documents for all the meetings. And I need to work with my best capacity, experience, and knowledge that I have. And I have to work fully hearted, fully dedicated for this work. And I think that when I am clear about my position and my tasks, then there would not be any difficulties to me in encountering with other agencies. Even though you know that women in the leading position is not very easy. So when I present the review reports and making statements and remarks about other areas, the areas that are very important, that the leaders who are men, it is not that easy, right? Because when we make remarks about your performance, if you are objective, it requires that your statements, your remarks be accurate and be convincing. And if you know well what you are talking about, then you can be really persuasive and convincing to the leaders of the agencies that you oversee. So I think that you just try your best. And I would forget about any disadvantages being a woman. So that's how I would work as a member of the People's Council and leading a really important committee of the Council. Thank you. Yes, thank you. The second part of the questions is about any experience that you could pass on or any message that you can send to your successors.
Kỳ nữa thì chắc tôi nghĩ rằng là có nhiều cái.
Because I think that with your experience, with 2 tenures in the People's Council, you can share some of your experience with your successors.
Đối với các nữ ứng viên là tham gia
for women candidates
đại biểu nữ mà sắp được
to this election, and also for the women members of People's Council,
tham gia hội đồng nhân dân là được cử tri tín nhiệm, thì tôi chỉ gửi gắm một
I just want to share with you one message. Please just try your best with all that you can, because apart from being an important member of your family, please try to spend time to improve your own knowledge, expertise, and your experience. And also be strong, because if you understand the issues very well, only then can you have your own opinion, and only then can you express your own opinion in a convincing manner. So please be in the right position as a member of People's Council, representing your community, representing your voter, and please know that you will be an important contributor to the policies of your province, of your locality. And you are also part of the decision-making process. And when policies adopted will have a lot of effects on people's lives, you should understand how a policy that you are going to endorse will make impacts on your voters' life, and so act responsibly, and also supervise the implementation, the enforcement of the policies in your locality, and not just stop
các chính cơ
at
quan.
the adoption of the policy. Overseeing the implementation is also another very important task that you need to assume, because policies also need to be adjusted to promote social and economic development of your community, because it is also about you and your family.
Thì tôi xin tham gia thêm một ý
And
kiến.
apart from the 2 questions that you asked, I would also like to share one of my comments about the women's proportion that we are working towards in 2030 of having more than 45% of candidates are from either gender. I only have one concern, that why currently the women proportion in the population is more than 50% already. But why the proportion of women in the leader position is still so modest? Resolutions and policies of the central parties plenums also said that we should try to work to increase this women's proportion.
Thì nói là chúng ta phấn đấu chỉ là
Dung from Hanoi said that we are only working on the women's proportion for candidates, for 45%, the candidates, right?
Yeah.
It's already very difficult. Why should it be difficult? Because it is really my concern. Is it because we lack policy? I don't think so, because it seems to me that the policies to protect women's interests are many. They are there in place. We don't lack policies. So why do we still have such low proportion of women as candidates and as members of elected bodies? My own experience is that when we have the construct the list of candidates, the political position of women in these associations, you know, that even though we have the same capabilities or qualifications, but still women are nominated for very low position. However, the political positions that would be assigned to those women is low. And I think that a natural question for voters would be that even if we select the women, then with these low positions in the agency or in the system, then would it work? Will it be effective? What should be the reason for this? Because we have very few women in the leading positions. That's why in election and in nomination, we have similar low proportion of women being there as candidates, let alone being selected. I think that for us to achieve the 35 or 45% target here, the positions, the proportion of women in the leader's position needs to be improved as well. I do not specialize in women's work or advocacy work, but I remember that there is a policy that in all lists in every activity of the state agency, gender mainstreaming, gender issue, gender equality should be mainstreamed. But what is the performance so far? We are to pursue the whole of these policies and regulations. We need to review what we have been doing so far and our performance so far. The proportion of women in leading positions is limited already. Training and promotion of women to the leader's position is also very modest. So if we have that modest proportion of women in those important positions, then of course we don't have many candidates. In the elected bodies. So that's my thinking. And I truly hope that women can enjoy the real and actual and meaningful equality. Because we have more than 50% of women in the total population already. Therefore, the voice of women should also be enhanced. If they do not represent completely and fully in various state agencies and in all systems, then of course they cannot protect and promote the interests of women. So serious implementation of the existing policy is very important. Please allow me to also add to Ms. Huyền point. You are totally right. Equality in National Assembly and People's Council is good, and people can also select the right candidate to the elected bodies. But what most important here is to bring more women to these elected bodies, because I think that many women, while being very successful, they may not be aware of their social responsibility. They don't want to bear this pressure.
Nữ giới nhưng mà lại ở vị trí rất thấp. Thế do vậy là rõ ràng cái người bầu người ta sẽ lựa chọn.
So obviously the voters will select from the list when the women candidates do not seem to have the advantages or the strengths like men. That's why we need to be able to mobilize more women as nominees, as candidates to this election, and telling them that this is a social responsibility that they need to perform. So I think that communication, education needs to be enhanced to enable the voters to select the good candidates. Thank you very much for very meaningful contribution, Mr. Đoàn. I just want to remind one thing. The policy implication of this research is that we suggest that perhaps that it's time for Vietnam to set out a target for 45% of representation of either gender in the election law. It means that we need to strengthen our policy calling for women representation. Because suddenly, when we look at the list of the candidates to National Assembly, we see that it is already 45% candidates being women. Why don't we legalize it? When don't we make it a law to convey this strong message so that by 2030, we can have at least 35% of members, actual members of the National Assembly and People's Council being women. Okay, so as Ms. Dow said, policies are there. We need to implement the policies. We still want to advocate for it further to strengthen this policy and make it a law, a legislation. Because when we have the good sourcing, only then can we have the actual proportion of women members of these elected bodies as expected. Yep, thank you for your advice. First, you need to have the expertise and qualifications and competencies, and second, you will have to be persistent in defending the view. Thank you, Mr. Đoàn, also. And the last panelist is a young person,
Tuy nhiên thì
young voter, a researcher from CEPEW. My question for this young voter is, as a voter,
là một cử tri trẻ vừa là nhà nghiên cứu về các vấn đề liên quan tới bầu cử thì
and also as a researcher in the election issues and being a man, what do you think about the women's representation in the elected bodies, and what can you say as a voter with the upcoming election? Thank you, Ms. Huyền, and good morning, everyone.
Với tôi thì cái cơ quan dân cử là trước tiên là một cái
elected
mình phải nhìn nhận
body should be seen as a vehicle through which a community and a society will make a collective decision that will have the social impact. And this is very important to ensure diversity and representation. And for me, gender is a very important aspect in all elected bodies because on the one hand, it helps ensure diversity. And second, when all voices are expressed and represented, it will help everyone. And I echo Ms. Hương that beside
cơ quan nó cũng
the gender issue itself, the gender issue is not only about men and women, it also needs to involve other groups in the society, particularly the marginalized and vulnerable groups, such as by ethnicity or by sexual orientation. So I think that the first element, diversity, is very important. So elected bodies need to be representative, ensuring diversity. Because you know that for women, they have the strengths that may not be easily understood by men. And we need to have the women's perspective and their different experience. So the structure in the elected bodies is very important because it needs to ensure this diversity. And it's also my observation from the work of the National Assembly in recent time. When I watched the discussion between a member from Ho Chi Minh City and another member on the labor issue, I think that women's perspective is very important as it gives us the details, the level of details that we might not see from men's perspective. And I think that it is also reflected in our research that women candidates, women's members usually are more attentive in listening to the details in the discussion at the National Assembly. I, as a voter, have been voting twice. And when I was 18, I did not go to vote because at that time I thought I was not really confident and I was not really concerned. I also did not trust the election. But then there was a time came to me when I realized that I need to face and I need to be involved. I need to be part of a certain system. And I need to have the interactions with the decision-making mechanism of such a system. And only when I recognize that, I see my role in voting as a voter. Many of my friends are not really very interested in politics. So through this discussion, if my friends or other people who are as young as me as the voters, I would call for your more interest, increasing interest in this collective decision making in voting, because it does not only give you an interest in the collective life, but it also has a meaning, an implication for you from the personal values perspective. As for the selection criteria,
của cô anh Đào ấy là
I would echo Ms. Đào that if we compare between men and women candidates, we see that women candidates are more disadvantaged in terms of the history of involvement in politics. So my view is that when we look at the voters, at the candidates, the top criteria here is the innovation or the novelty. I mean, for me, the women candidates, even though they may not have a lot of experience in politics, but I need to see a new element. I need to see new people and new perspective in the elections. So for me, what would matters the most is whether or not these candidates, when being elected, can bring new mindset, can bring new things to politics, to the National Assembly or People's Council. Thank you, Luân, very much for your input.
Rồi, thì mong rằng là chúng ta sẽ có một cái sự lựa chọn trong cái quá trình là đọc các.
So we hope that the voters will make the right decision and choosing the person that they find the most appropriate with the criteria. And now we have a little bit of an open discussion before we wrap up the discussion today. And we have received a number of questions on Zoom. In the chat box. So we have received a couple of questions here. Please allow me to read the first question for the research team from the Australian Embassy. So the question is about the objectivity of this research when you obtain the opinions from the people, from the very people, the members of the National Assembly and People's Council about their own performance. Would it be seen as objective? And the second question, what would be the most important contribution of women members in the last legislature? And a specific example would be useful. The third question is asked by Ms. Huyền, that from the role and performance of women members of the National Assembly, can you point out to the specific contributions made by women members in 2016-2021 legislature? For example, in which laws or which policy or policy change to the change in the policy issues in order to create the policy change is very important when it comes to contribution from the members of National Assembly. So can the research team point to the specific policy pursuit of women members and the specific outcomes resulting from that participation, from the listening and making policy influence to pursuing the policy issues and creating policy changes? Okay, so we've got 3 questions. And the fourth question, why not setting the target of 35% right for this election this year? Okay, so 4 questions. Perhaps the first question from Australian Embassy will be addressed by Mr. Tuấn Anh about the objectivity in asking the members of elected bodies to rate their own performance. Thank you very much. So with regard to this first question about the objectivity in this research, as you all know, this research is based on both quantitative and qualitative research, and we conducted in-depth interviews and survey questionnaires conducted with the members of National Assembly and People's Council. And I could say that it is objective. Why could we say so? Because the views and the responses here are based on their own experience from interactions with the voters. So their responses built on the actual experience, actual work, actual activities that they've been performing, and the actual interactions with the voter. That's why we believe, we are confident that it is objective. However, I also have to say that if we had more time to further this research, but to obtain the perspective of voters and other social groups, then of course the research findings will be more valuable. So that's my response to the first question. I would also like to add to this response of the topic here. We talk about roles, performance, and contributions. So assessing the impact of any activity, like we heard from Ms. Thùy Dương from Hanoi, pursuing and being persistent in pursuing the policy issues, there would be certain difficulties and obstacles, right? So it is their own assessment, self-assessment. But of course, from the social perspective, we need to gauge this assessment from sociology surveys. Yes, and there are always a question about objectivity with any self-assessment. And it, of course, it would be ideal to have a 360-degree assessment. But within the scope of this research, we still have only one perspective from the self-assessment. But of course, the other perspective from voters would also be a valuable element. But you know that for the members of the elected bodies, they are both practitioners and they are also exercising the oversight function. That's why we are fairly confident in the value of their responses.
Câu hỏi thứ hai ạ. Câu hỏi thứ hai thì chắc là mời chị
Second
Hà.
question, Ms. Ha, please, can you talk about the 35%? Why would we not aim at 35% right at this legislature? You know that in recent tenures at the National Assembly and People's Councils, we did not reach 30%. But historically, there were times we had 32% of women in National Assembly. However, there are different bases or grounds for us to identify this target, the actual situation of the country, and also at which policy level. Ideally, these targets are legalized in the legislations on election and the organizational structure of the elected bodies. And so when we amended the election law to National Assembly and People's Council in 2015, for the first time, the proportion of women candidates is legalized in this law, not below 35%. However, internationally, there are other ways of providing these targets. For example, they may provide for the proportion of nominees, of candidates, and requesting for the quality candidates, and then asking for the proportion of selected or elected members. The second way is to provide for the proportion of women candidates to be reached, to be achieved.
Tức là định hướng để cử tri và các bên giới thiệu thì quy định cái tỷ lệ nữ đại biểu. Thì hiện tại Việt Nam của chúng ta đã đang quy định theo cả hai cách. Tức là
So in Vietnam we have the policies in both ways. In the resolutions of the Party National Program on Gender Equality and Government Regulations, we are working towards having 30%, a certain proportion of women in the state agencies, in the National Assembly by 35% by 2030. And there is another way of providing for women proportion is the women seats in certain organizations. For example, 35% of women in the National Assembly. And if women are not elected to those seats, then men cannot get those seats. and we will wait until those seats are filled by women, and several countries in the world provide in that way. However, generally speaking, we would see the regulations calling for the women and proportion. So for this legislature, for this election, we have the proportion of candidates, women candidates of 45%, and in certain areas it is 70%. That's why there is a reason for us to believe that it is time for Vietnam to discuss and legislate for the proportion of each gender in running for election, or having the seats in certain agencies and organizations of not below 45%, to protect not only women, but even men, if there are certain places where the male proportion can be lower. Because we can observe even in the committees of the National Assembly, in certain committees, men account for a very low percentage. So gender here is not only for women. The gender balance, gender equity here is to protect the equal opportunities and contributions for all genders. So we see that we have the laws and we also have other policies to reach the targets of this women's proportion. And when the research team conducts this quantitative research, we obtain their opinions, but we also used the videos and the records to listen to the voicing of members in the National Assembly sittings or People's Council's meetings to validate our statements. So we have the cross-check and we have validation of our remarks in this research. Thank you, Ms. Hà. And Ms. Luân Thu Hiền also shared her view, and I think that we can think about it because this is a plan, right? Because so I think that Ms. Luân Thu Hiền can discuss with us about the possibility of developing a gender index, including the women in politics indicator. So in order to assess the impact of a candidate, of a member, of a deputy or delegate, we will need to wait until their tenure expires, right? But for this election, we can only know about the candidates, and we can only know the performance of previous terms delegates. So the impact assessment can only come at the end of a process. For research, we have the baseline, we have the progress assessment and the impact assessment. But as of now, we do not yet conduct this impact assessment because some of the members of the current legislature, current tenure, can continue into the next tenure, but they can stop like Ms. Dương. So we can also think about these performance and contributions of the women members throughout the entire tenure, and how and what kind of impact have they contributed. But they are still now in the process, so that's why it's very difficult for us to have this impact assessment. There is a comment, a very interesting comment from Ms. Nguyễn Thị Thanh Tâm. And I think that it can be a concluding remark for this discussion. The research findings are very interesting and confirming the confidence for the members of National Assembly and People's Councils on the capacity and the determination of women members for the development of the country and locality. And I would hope that in the future there will be a more in-depth research on why women's proportion in this elected body is still low and what should be the solutions for that. the role of oversight and the oversight system for policy implementation is very important. And we also need to sanction measures where the gender equality policies are not well implemented. And the oversight needs to be conducted on an ongoing basis. So I would like to have a question for all the elected members here. Should we have a monitoring and evaluation system, qualitative or quantitative, for the performance of our work? If there is such a monitoring system, would you be willing to join, to be part of it? So if we can monitor the inputs and then the process and then the outcomes of engagement of members of elected bodies, would it be a good idea? So you can leave your comments or send your emails to us, because I don't think that we have much time left. So final remarks from Dr. Minh before Diana makes closing remarks. Well, thank you very much for joining our virtual discussion today. Yes, we have taken notes of all your questions and your comments here in a very constructive manner. For example, I find the question about objectivity very interesting, because you know that we can approach a question from different angles, from different perspectives. We may ask the members of the elected bodies themselves about their performance, about how they view their activities. But the qualitative research is not the most important part of this research. But we could also hear from one voter that there is a thematic study on the implementation of the law against children abuse, of the policies against children abuse, for example, and that is seen as a very positive program. And as a result of that activity, we see a reduced number of incidents of children abuse, for example. Or the initiative in the school safety is also a great idea coming from the work of a member of National Assembly and Council. And I believe that this is the issue of mutual interest in many different provinces and of the entire country that calls for the joint hand of the entire society. So I think that these are the very actual and very vivid and tangible contributions by members of elected bodies. And in the future, I think that the research can go further into more specific topics. But you know that policy analysis and policy research is a process. It looks at the inputs first, and then it requires discussion and debates among the state agencies, so that finally we come up with a policy as an outcome. And then the policies or the actions will also be tested by the views and by the responses from the communities that are receiving these policies. And then it comes back to the input stage, of the cycle. So I think and I hope that this research, this study will be continued into the future. And thank you for all your questions and comments. And we'll try our best to improve this piece of research. But frankly saying, women's members of elected bodies in the last tenure, the last 5 years, have significantly contributed to the success of Vietnam. because without their contribution, we cannot have gained the results that we have had so far. Never before have we received such a high appreciation for all our efforts and be recognized as a successful container of COVID-19 with the positive growth of 3%. So I think that all of these is attributed to the contributions of Vietnamese state agencies and public sector as well as private sector, and the contributions of women at all levels. So while we may not be able to measure accurately these contributions, but definitely it is attributed to their contributions. Now I'd like to hand over to Ms. Diana Torres from UNDP Vietnam with the closing remarks. Diana, over to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to wrap up this very interesting and insightful conversation that we held this morning. Let me first thank the University of Social Science and Humanities for co-hosting this important discussion and co-leading this study with us together with UNDP. Also want to thank, of course, our donors and partners, the Australian Embassy and the Embassy of Ireland for co-funding and helping us to kind of develop this study as initial research to continue exploring the issues of women's roles and participation in elected bodies. I want to thank the moderators and the panelists that joined us today in this discussion. It was really, really insightful for me. I think a lot of ideas came up from this discussion from the two panels, both on the roles of women at the national level and at the provincial level. And I really took note of a lot of ideas and insights of how we can continue engaged in this conversation and improving and strengthening gender equality and women's participation in elected bodies moving forward. And also let me thank for those who are joining online still, following us on Facebook, for your patience and for your engagement during this discussion. I think just three key things from my side, just to wrap up. First of all, I think based on the conversation we had today and the experiences from representatives both at the provincial level and at the national level, and from the different voices that we
study findings, there is no doubt that women have the competences to perform equally well as men in both in elected bodies. So there is no doubt, there is research, there is evidence that they are fully equipped and competent to perform very well in these elected bodies. So I hope that these insights and this conversation is giving confidence and strengthening the confidence of voters to go and vote for women in the upcoming elections, and to, as some of the panelists today expressed, demonstrate their commitment to gender equality and to improve gender equality in Vietnam. This is a clear demonstration moving forward when you put your vote and your confidence for women's candidates, both at national and provincial level. The second is, of course, Vietnam has done a great job at national level compared to other countries in terms of securing women's representation at national level in the National Assembly. However, we are still below the target set at national level, at least by the Communist Party, by the party. And then I heard a lot of ideas today of what are those barriers and obstacles that are preventing that. One, Vietnam achieves its own targets, and second, that we start a conversation about increasing the targets, because the target in any case of 35% remain low. So there are barriers related to social norms and specifically biases against women and low confidence in the performance and role of women that we still need to work on, and that's a long journey. But there are also barriers in terms of the
legal framework that we could work all together to analyze and assess and understand what will be the roadmap to really increase and make sure that this becomes a reality for Vietnam in the future. In terms of what else is needed in terms of evidence and assessments, I heard a lot of comments regarding the limitation of the study, but I just want to confirm that this is just an initial assessment. But I heard a lot of comments of extra research that is needed in terms of assessing what has been, in fact, the contribution of women in Vietnam's development and in the elected bodies. I want just to remind everyone that in the previous tenure of the National Assembly, we had for the first time women a chairwoman of the National Assembly, and which was completely successful and demonstrated excellent role in driving the National Assembly and the performance of the National Assembly in the previous tenure. So we already have good cases and role models to kind of base our assessment. Just once again, I don't want to take much of your time, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and please send us your feedback and ideas. UNDP will continue to be engaged in this issue of women's representation in elected bodies and women's leadership and empowerment, and we'll look forward to continue our partnership with the University of Social Science and Humanities, with the Women's Union, and with many partners from civil society and academics and the government to see how we can increase gender equality in Vietnam at all levels and secure that women have their voice and participation in elected bodies, both at national and local level. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and I wish you a good day ahead. Thank you.
Trân trọng cảm ơn bà Diana Torres và tất cả các quý vị. Xin hẹn gặp lại các quý vị vào ngày 23 tháng 5. Và chúng ta sẽ lựa chọn được những đại biểu có tài, có đức tham gia vào cơ quan quyền lực cao nhất của Việt Nam, cũng như là của các tỉnh và thành phố. Xin trân trọng cảm ơn. Xin chào và hẹn gặp lại.
Xin chào nhé, chào anh Hoàng.
Cảm ơn anh chị Dung ạ, và rất là mong được tiếp tục hợp tác trong các và trân trọng cảm ơn tất cả các khán giả đang theo dõi chương trình livestream. Thật sự là rất là xin lỗi trong những giây phút đầu tiên thì chúng ta không phải đến 30 phút đầu tiên chúng ta gặp rất là nhiều trục trặc trong vấn đề kỹ thuật, nhưng mà nhờ có sự nhiệt huyết của các quý vị theo dõi trong suốt chương trình, cho nên chúng ta cũng vẫn có được một số lượng lớn những người theo dõi chương trình. Trân trọng cảm ơn và hẹn gặp lại trong một cái dịp được trao đổi thảo luận về một vấn đề tương tự như thế này trong dịp tới ạ. Vâng, cảm ơn ạ.